The pain struck like a hammer in the dark, sharp and blinding, jolting me awake at 3:47 a.m. I remember the glowing red numbers on the clock beside my bed as I clutched my head, certain something inside me was breaking. At 66 years old, I had endured headaches before, but this was different. It felt like my body was warning me that the end might be near. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed my son, Miles. Straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice thin and trembling, begging him to call back. 20 minutes later, silence. I dialed again. Voicemail again. Desperation drove me to call Joy, my daughter-in-law, though I knew she never welcomed my calls. She answered with irritation, sharp in her voice, and when I explained I was in pain and might need an ambulance, her reply sliced me deeper than the headache itself. "We're on a family vacation, Marlene. Don't bother us unless someone is literally dying." The line went dead, and I stared at the phone, realizing I had been dismissed by the very people I thought I mattered to most. I dialed 911 myself. By the time the paramedics arrived, I had collapsed on the kitchen floor. The sirens blurred into the pounding in my head, and voices asked me questions I could barely answer. In the emergency room, tests were run, IVs inserted, and doctors hovered with urgent concern. Dr. Peterson, a woman close to my age, finally explained that I had suffered a severe tension headache worsened by dangerously high blood pressure. I would need to stay overnight. I asked if anyone had been able to reach my son. The nurse shook her head sadly. They had tried. No answer. That was when the truth landed like a stone in my chest. I was utterly alone. As monitors beeped steadily in the dim hospital room, I thought of all the sacrifices I had made for my family. The money I had loaned that was never returned, the countless hours spent babysitting Emma and Tommy, my grandchildren, the down payments I'd covered, the meals I'd cooked. All the while, I told myself I was investing in love and belonging. Yet here I was, forgotten in a hospital bed, while they enjoyed sandy beaches and laughter without me. A kind nurse named Maria adjusted my IV that night and whispered gently, "Sometimes family doesn't know how to handle these things." But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't that they didn't know how. It was that they didn't care enough to try. Morning brought sunlight through the blinds, and no messages on my phone. No concern, no apology, no recognition that I might have been dying. Instead of crushing me, the silence lifted a fog I hadn't realized I was living under. For decades, I had been so eager to please, to earn scraps of affection, that I had erased myself. But lying there, I realized something, pieces of me were still left. Not much, but enough. Dr. Peterson noticed my change when she came for rounds. She sat with me, her tone gentle but firm, reminding me that while I couldn't control how others treated me, I could control how I responded. For the first time, I admitted aloud that I was tired of pretending their neglect didn't hurt. That night, I reached for the notepad beside my bed and began to write. The first list was long, everything I had given them: money, childcare, time, patience, and love. The second list was shorter, embarrassingly so, what I had received in return. Obligatory thanks, a few family photos, and constant requests for more. The third list was the hardest, what I wanted for myself. At first, my pen hovered unused to writing dreams instead of obligations. Then slowly, words appeared. I wanted to travel to Italy, a dream I had pushed aside every time Miles or Joy needed something. I wanted to take art classes again, to rediscover the joy I had left behind when my son was born. I wanted friends who valued me simply for my company, not for what I could provide. Most of all, I wanted to stop living on the edges of other people's lives. By the time I was discharged, I was clear-headed in more ways than one. I refused to call Miles for a ride. Instead, I took a taxi home and looked at my little cottage with new eyes. The rooms no longer felt like waiting spaces for a family who rarely visited. They were mine. That evening, I unplugged my landline, poured a glass of wine in my neglected garden, and opened a drawer full of travel brochures I had collected over the years. For once, I wasn't going to wait for anyone's permission. A week later, when Miles finally called, his cheerful voice spoke of beaches and fun. When I told him I had been in the hospital, his shock sounded rehearsed, his excuses hollow. He brushed it off as poor cell service, as though I hadn't called, and left messages. When he invited me to a family barbecue asking me to bring my potato salad and beer, I realized nothing had changed. I wasn't being invited as a mother or grandmother. I was being enlisted as staff. For the first time in my life, I said no. The silence on the other end of the line was stunned, then angry. Miles accused me of being unfair. I told him plainly I was done being the family ATM, done being taken for granted. His voice cracked with disbelief, but I was calm. I told him I was going to Italy with my neighbor Eleanor. He sputtered about the money, but I reminded him I had plenty now, that I wasn't funding their lives. When they showed up at my door days later, Joy's mask of sweetness barely covered her fury. They called me dramatic, selfish, irresponsible. But I didn't flinch. I told them the truth. I had spent years trying to buy my way into a family that had never really wanted me. That ended now. Miles's fist tightened on the porch rail, while Joy's smile thinned to a blade. I kept the door half closed and my breath even. When Joy chirped that family works things out, I asked which part of family included telling a sick woman not to call, unless someone was literally dying. Miles deflected, minimizing what had happened, calling it a headache, not a medical emergency. It was as if the hospital wristband still in my purse belonged to a stranger. I told them I was finished with errands, disguised as invitations with holidays, where my casserole had a seat, but I did not. Joy accused me of selfishness. I felt strangely calm as a tide going out. If I cannot be valued without paying admission, I said I will not attend. I closed the door, gently turned the deadbolt, and leaned against the wood until the quiet settled like a warm shawl. They called in bursts after that, the way summer storms break and clear and break again. By the next afternoon, I stopped answering. When the doorbell rang at 8:12 p.m., I checked the peephole and saw Miles holding Emma and Tommy by their small hands. I opened, kneeling to eye level. Emma's mouth shook as she said that Daddy told her I didn't want to see them. My rage rose and then softened, redirecting like a river, finding the wider path. I told the children I loved them forever, no matter what, that grown-ups were sorting out grown-up things and that none of it was their fault. I stood and faced my son. Do not make them carry your message, I said. If you have something to say to me, say it yourself. He called me cold. I told him boundaries are not temperature, they are direction. He left bristling, and I stood in the hall breathing until my shoulders dropped. Morning returned me to my lists. I added a new one titled, What I Will Protect. I wrote down my home, my peace, my time, my access to joy, my dignity, my future friendships, my health. I wrote the words twice, then circled them. When Eleanor called to ask if I felt like walking at 10:00 a.m., I said yes. We strolled our quiet street, smelling jacaranda and coffee. If we are truly going to Italy, she said we should practice stairs. We laughed and climbed the long block where the pavement rose toward a square of sky-counting steps like pilgrims. By Thursday, Joy's silver SUV had appeared on my street 3 times. Eleanor knocked at 3:15 p.m. to say Joy had been photographing my front yard and had tailed me to the market the previous day. A chill slid along my spine, bracing me with a different kind of clarity. I called the attorney the hospital advocate had recommended and scheduled a consultation for Friday at 2:00 p.m. He told me to begin a log immediately. I opened a new notebook and with the precision of a bookkeeper recorded dates times with AM and PM license plate numbers and summaries of every voicemail that crossed the line between disappointed and coercive. It felt like replacing guesswork with witness. At 2:00 p.m. sharp the next day, David Morrison met me in an office lined with law books and a sunlit ficus. He listened without interruption, his pen moving only to mark the edges where behavior turned into harassment. He said that the road was familiar to him, that love and leverage often wore each other's jackets. He recommended security cameras, and a cease and desist letter explained how documentation becomes a spine when a story needs to stand up in court. I signed the retainer agreement, feeling the weight in my chest shift from helpless to anchored. By 4:30 p.m., I had a plan and a folder labeled with my own name, not my role in someone else's life. The letter went out Monday at 9:05 a.m. The backlash arrived before noon. A post bloomed on Joy's social media, a careful performance about a wayward mother-in-law abandoning her family, complete with photos of the children looking solemn. Comments sprouted like thistles. I read only enough to know the shape of the narrative, and then stopped. Eleanor printed one copy for my file and pressed my hand like a sister. That evening, I installed the cameras, climbed the step stool myself, and tested each angle until the front walk and porch were framed squarely. The quiet click of the system arming felt like a door locking inside me, not against the world, but for the room where my life would be safe. On Wednesday, at 7:42 p.m., the camera captured Miles peering through my front window. At 8:19 p.m., my phone pinged with a message from an account I did not recognize, calling me heartless and warning me what happens to bad grandmothers. I added both to the log. On Thursday morning, I found a plastic trash bag on my porch with a note reading, "This is what you are." I photographed the bag in place then again after moving it with gloves into a bin. I did not cry. I did not rage. I wrote the time 9:11 a.m. and took a walk beneath the fig trees. In the middle of this life flowed forward with its own refuse of sweetness. At my first art class on Saturday from 10:00 a.m. to 1:00 p.m., I forgot everything but water and light. The instructor, Patricia, tapped the edge of my paper and murmured that my shadows had courage. I smiled, surprised by the compliment and by the fact that I believed it. After class, we shared tea in paper cups, and I told her I had once loved drawing before motherhood shook the pencils from my hands. She said, "They are yours again. Keep them." The sentence felt like a benediction. Sunday brought an unexpected call from a woman named Dorothy, who said she had survived a similar story and came out whole. "Children learn from what we tolerate," she said softly, around 5:20 p.m. Sometimes the gift is to leave what teaches the wrong lesson. When we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and looked at my lists. The columns no longer felt like proof for a courtroom. They felt like a map I had drawn for myself in a dark forest, one deliberate mark at a time, showing the path that led out. The weeks that followed became a study in contrast. On one side, the harassment persisted, unanswered calls stacking like stones, anonymous messages accusing me of cruelty, the silver SUV idling at odd hours. On the other side, my life bloomed with quiet victories. Each entry in my log strengthened my resolve, while each brushstroke in art class restored a piece of myself I had once abandoned. I was learning that freedom is not the absence of conflict, but the choice to build elsewhere. 3 months passed this way. By then, the cease and desist letter had turned into more than paper. It was a wall I chose not to breach. Miles tried to weaponize the children again, arriving at my door, with Emma clutching her stuffed rabbit, asking why Grandma no longer loved them. I knelt, held her face in my hands, and told her love does not vanish, because adults disagree. I reminded her she was never at fault. Miles called me selfish, and I replied that refusing to be used is not selfish, it is survival. I closed the door gently and wrote down the time 7:14 p.m. in the log. Later that night, I looked at the photo of Emma on my mantle and whispered that she would understand one day. Joy escalated her campaign on social media, painting me as unstable, ungrateful, bitter. Strangers I would never meet judged me in comments, some vicious, some pitying. But something unexpected happened. A few people questioned why adult children would humiliate their own mother publicly. Old friends who had once drifted away began reaching out, asking quietly if I was all right. Over coffee with my friend Janet, she admitted they had long suspected I was being drained, but hadn't known how to intervene. "You were disappearing into their needs," she said gently. "We could see it, but you defended them every time." She was right. I had clung to a version of family that only existed in my mind, terrified that if I let it go, I would have nothing. Now I knew better. Letting it go was the only way to have anything at all. It was Dorothy, the older woman who had called me out of the blue, who gave me the most clarity. She invited me to a small circle of women who had faced the same pattern, mothers drained by entitled children, grandmothers cut off unless they provided money or services. We met monthly in a cafe on Main Street, sipping coffee while trading stories that were painful yet familiar. Margaret, whose 3 sons emptied her retirement savings. Patricia, my art instructor, who discovered her daughter had forged her signature on checks. Alice, whose son-in-law had convinced her daughter to keep the grandchildren away. Different details, same wound. Together, we discovered that what had happened to us was not individual failure, but a pattern, a cycle passed down until someone decided to break it. I decided it would end with me. 6 months after that night in the hospital, I stood in Tuscany at sunset. The hills rolled away in gold and green, dotted with olive trees. Eleanor, my dear neighbor turned travel companion, handed me a glass of Chianti and laughed as we recalled our clumsy attempt to order dinner in broken Italian. "When you first suggested this trip," she said, "I thought you were having a breakdown." I smiled at the horizon. "The best kind," I answered. The harassment had slowed to a trickle by then, especially after an investigator from Adult Protective Services visited my home and found not a victim, but a woman thriving. Miles and Joy's attempts to weaponize the system had only revealed their own desperation. My log, my cameras, and my lawyer had built a shield too sturdy for their tactics. Italy felt like rebirth. Eleanor and I took a cooking class from a woman named Lucia, who told us to cook with love, but for ourselves first. I painted countryside scenes in my travel sketchbook, the strokes shaky but proud. At night, I lay in hotel rooms listening to the foreign hum of cicadas and realized I was not lonely. I was full. I had chosen a life where my value did not depend on being useful to someone else's convenience. It felt like oxygen after years of breathing through a straw. Returning home, I decorated my cottage with souvenirs and photographs, turning it into a gallery of proof that my happiness could exist on my own terms. My guest room became an art studio, canvases leaning against the walls, where grandchildren's toys once cluttered the space. My kitchen table transformed into a planning station for new adventures. I even began dating a gentle widower from my hiking group named Richard, who understood the exhaustion of giving too much to those who only take. Over dinner one evening, he told me that difficult children teach us more about limits than anyone else. "You spend years trying to fix it," he said, "and one day, you realize the fixing isn't yours to do." His words lingered like balm. Then one quiet morning, the test arrived. My phone rang at 9:18 a.m., and Miles's name appeared on the screen. His voice was different this time, not bright or angry, but tentative. He said he and Joy had been talking, that maybe they hadn't handled things well. He said the children missed me. He asked if we could start over, perhaps meet for lunch. The old me would have clutched at the offer, desperate for any scrap of reconciliation. The new me breathed slowly and chose my words with care. I told him I was open to conversation, but only if he understood that I was not returning to the woman who served without question. I had boundaries now, and they were not negotiable. Silence stretched on the line. Then he said he thought he understood. We set a tentative date for lunch. When the call ended, I looked around my art studio at the canvases drying the brochures for future trips, the evidence of a life I had rebuilt. Whatever happened with Miles and Joy, I knew I would be fine. Better than fine, I was free. The day of the lunch arrived with the same hush as any morning, but my hands trembled slightly as I buttoned my blouse. This was not fear of confrontation, but the awareness that I was stepping into a familiar room with a new spine. At noon, I met Miles at a quiet cafe downtown. He looked older than I remembered, lines etched by stress or guilt I couldn't tell. For a moment, I saw the boy he once was, the child who ran into my arms after school, the teenager who whispered his dreams late at night. But that boy had grown into a man who had forgotten the value of his mother until she withdrew it. We spoke cautiously at first, sipping water, skirting around the past. He admitted that Joy had been furious with me, but also that some of my words had unsettled him in ways he couldn't ignore. He asked what I needed from him. I told him the truth: respect, honesty, inclusion, without expectation of payment or service. I told him I would not cater, babysit, or bankroll my way into his life anymore. If he wanted a relationship, it had to stand on its own legs. He nodded slowly, as if testing the weight of my words. We parted without resolution, but with something close to possibility. As I walked back to my car, I realized that whether reconciliation happened or not was secondary. What mattered was that I had spoken clearly and held my ground. I had proven to myself that my worth did not hinge on his response. The months that followed became a season of renewal. I painted daily my small studio filled with landscape still lifes and tentative portraits. Patricia encouraged me to submit pieces for a local gallery showing, and to my astonishment, 3 paintings sold. The sums were modest, but the validation immense. I had created something others valued not for obligation, but for beauty. Eleanor and I planned new travels, flipping through brochures with laughter over tea. Richard walked with me on Saturday mornings, our conversations easy, unburdened by the weight of expectation. For the first time since my youth, my life felt like mine. Emma and Tommy remained in my heart. Sometimes I caught glimpses of them in town with their parents, their faces bright with childhood. I prayed that one day they would seek me out on their own terms. Until then, I chose not to force the bond through a wall of manipulation. Love, I knew now, was not measured by how much one endured, but by how much one honored both self and others. As the seasons turned, my health improved. The headaches vanished, my blood pressure stabilized, and I slept deeply through nights once haunted by anxiety. Even Dr. Peterson remarked that I looked younger, lighter. "Stress ages more than time," she said with a smile, and I believed her. My home transformed as well, no longer a waiting room for reluctant visitors, but a sanctuary of my own. The garden bloomed under my care roses, and lavender thriving as if grateful for my attention. Looking back, I understood that my journey was not only about walking away from neglect, but about walking toward myself. I had confused sacrifice with devotion, obligation with love, usefulness with worth. Breaking that cycle felt like betrayal at first, but in truth, it was salvation. I learned that family is not defined solely by blood, but by those who show up when you need them, by those who respect the space you carve for your own soul. To anyone listening now, I ask you this: what would you do in my place? Would you keep giving until nothing of you remained, or would you dare to choose yourself at last? It is never too late to reclaim the pieces you've given away. Love freely, but never at the cost of your dignity. Respect yourself first, and the world will learn to respect you too. If my story moved you, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who might need the reminder, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the strength hidden in ordinary lives. Most of all, leave a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, or share your own journey. Together, we can remind each other that choosing ourselves is not selfish. It is the first step toward freedom.